Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining me today in my little mini session. Hi, Christina. Um, in my mini little session on community cultural wealth and school partnerships. So happy to have you here as we talk through a couple of ideas. And going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Pranjali Upadhyay, and I am Integrated Curriculum Coordinator. That's my title at ESD 112. I do a lot of curriculum development and a lot of teacher professional development in my region and across the state. And I have a specific interest in social justice and equity and applying that to our school systems to transform the experience that our students have in school. It's a little bit about me. So if you could take a look at this quote for a second, read it for me. So feel free to share if you have any thoughts in our chat window about that quote. I think a lot of my growth in education comes from me just thinking more deeply about the purpose of education and the why behind all of what we do for our students. Okay, so what we're going to do today is I will introduce you to a framework, and it's a framework created by Dr. Tara Yoso, and essentially it's a framework for looking at the community cultural wealth that exists within the communities that we work with. So there's a couple of assumptions that we have to consider before we start looking at kind of reimagining what leadership can and should look like in our school spaces. So there's this, so here are a couple of the assumptions that we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into the framework. And then I'll ask us to kind of apply it a little bit to our own context that we're working in. So according to Dr. Yoso, society values the knowledge of white upper class and middle classes. There's often this narrative that perpetuates this false belief that people of color lack social cultural capital required for social mobility. I've heard that narrative quite often, that we need to build our students' social capital by giving them, teaching them how to function in society. When we say that without recognizing the capital that's already there, that's not a good thing. So as a result, schools most often work from this assumption in structuring ways to help disadvantaged students whose race and class and background has left them lacking necessary knowledge, social skills, abilities, and cultural capital. So that's kind of what where we enter and how we often structure our school systems. So Dr. Yoso strongly challenges these assumptions that students of color enter our classrooms with a cultural deficit. So we are challenging that, and I will give you some tools today. We're going to be able to look at that through a different, reframe that perspective in a different way. So before we get into that, we must talk a little bit about critical race theory, as that is what Dr. Tara Yoso actually built her framework upon. I know that this is something that is kind of floating in the collective space, and people have a lot of feelings about it. So I think it's good to understand critical race theory as a tool to look more critically at our system. So I'm going to give you a really quick snapshot of the main points of this. But first, let's talk about where it came from. So critical race theory was crafted by legal scholars in the field of law, led by Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, and Alan Freeman. And then it was later applied to education by Gloria Letts and Billings. And it expanded to include experiences of groups who experienced various types of oppression and marginalization, and whose experiences weren't really being recognized by the society they live in. So their voices were being silenced often. Their truth was not really being appreciated. There was no space for it until we have critical race theory, which is taking a look at how oppression actually happens. Does any of you have any thoughts or questions right now? Okay, please feel free to keep stuff going, questions, thoughts in the chat window for me. That'd be great. So let's take a look at. So the tenets of critical race theory, there's 5 of them that I will share with you today. I think this stuff is just good to know too, because in order to be a social justice advocate, it's important to have critical race theory as a tool that you can apply. So here are a couple of tenets of critical race theory. One, that race and racism are central, endemic, permanent, and a fundamental part of defining and explaining how U.S. society functions. So CRT challenges white privilege, refutes claims that educational institutions are actually fair. So we're challenging that assumption that there is an equal playing field and that schools and school systems actually are created and intended for the success of all students, challenging that assumption. CRT is also committed to social justice and offers liberatory or transformative response to oppression. So we're not looking for just thinking about something. We're looking for really dissecting, identifying oppression within our systems, and then transforming and changing them to be less oppressive. So that's a couple tenets. And then there's 2 more that I wanted to share with you. So CRT recognizes that the experiences of people of color are legitimate, appropriate, and critical to understanding how we teach about racial subordination, how we analyze it, and how we transform our systems to become more just. So that's a very important part of CRT. It also goes beyond disciplinary boundaries and analyzes race and racism through historical context and draws from a variety of different fields. So we're not just only focused on the present moment, we're looking at history and the evidence in history of injustice and oppression. And then we're also looking into other areas and disciplines and leveraging the scholarship of different fields to truly understand how to transform our systems to be more socially just. So those are a few of the, it's like a really quick overview of critical race theory, which is really important in understanding Dr. Yoso's framework. So I will go ahead and pause there. If you have any questions or thoughts, if you could please share with me before we move on to looking at the framework for community cultural wealth. Any thoughts, questions, ideas? I don't know if you've seen a summary of critical race theory before. It's been kind of floating there everywhere, been the source of some controversies and tensions in certain areas, but it's good to know what it's actually about. Okay, so I will move on. And so the community cultural wealth framework is based on this article that I've linked for you, and I'm going to actually post the slideshow link into the chat window so you have access to that. Okay, so please go ahead and click on that, and you'll get into our slideshow. And then I would highly recommend reading that article when you have a chance to, but I'll give you a little bit of a summary of its main points. Okay, so this is a quick overview of our framework, and then we're going to just quickly think about it and apply it to our context that we work in. So take a look at this diagram. So we're arguing, thank you, Sarah. We're arguing against the mindset and the narrative that communities of color have deficiencies that prevent them from being successful. So it's often a narrative that you're going to hear, sometimes overtly, sometimes in more subtle ways. I hear it all the time, just about how either parents of color, communities of color don't value education, are lacking in certain ways, and we are really pushing back against those biased assumptions and replacing that with a framework that focuses on and acknowledges the cultural capital, the wealth that exists within communities that really is a asset to our students and their families, and should be acknowledged in the school space. So that's where you can take a look at these, and then I'll go into each one of them in a second, more detailed. Okay, I see we got a couple people in there. Okay, so oh, something happened to the screen share. Okay, I think it's back. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is aspirational capital. So this refers to the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers. So this is an important trait that many of our students and their families have, that should be taken into consideration when we are establishing that relationship with our students and their families. Linguistic capital includes the intellectual and social skills attained through communication experiences in more than one language and or style. There's a lot of research that shows how speaking more than one language is incredibly helpful for a student in various ways. And that isn't something that's often valued in our school systems. I could tell you a personal story. When I was in elementary school, I'm bilingual, I'm multilingual. When I entered school, I spoke Hindi because my family is originally from India, and English, a little bit of English. And because I was a speaker of more than one language, obviously I was categorized as an English language learner. And it was not until I was 12 that I was identified as a highly capable student. And so at that point, at 12 years old, that's when I was officially put on a track that was different than the track I was originally on. I was fluently reading by the time I was 6 or 7. So, but the way that I was labeled by that school system put me on a certain track. And then by the time I was 12 and I was put on a highly capable track, I already was behind quite a bit in mathematics. So after taking summer school for several years and trying to catch up, by the time I ended high school, I still was not able to max out on the math offerings that my school offered. And that affected the colleges I got into. That affected my ability to compete with other students who had, 1 year extra of a certain kind of math that I didn't have. So the ways in which we frame our students as they enter our systems impact their lives. They impact them far beyond when they leave our classroom. So it's very important that linguistic capital specifically is also recognized and actually seen as a form of capital versus a deficit. There's my little story for you. So another, our next area of cultural wealth community cultural wealth is familial capital. And this refers to those cultural knowledges nurtured among family that carry a sense of community, history, memory, and cultural intuition. So there's family values and relationships and knowledge that has been passed from generation to generation that is of importance that is seldom valued by schools. It's really not often valued by schools. I could probably give you another example of that if, sure, why not? So, because I'm Indian, all my personal examples are going to be about that. When I was growing up, culturally, we have the earth is actually in our culture is personified as a goddess. So we have like a goddess of the earth. So while I was growing up, whenever we were outdoors, we would, let's say we were little, we threw a piece of trash on the floor. My parents would tell me like, oh, you absolutely can't do that. That's so disrespectful to Mother Earth. It's just really disrespectful. You can't do that. That's not allowed. She's our earth goddess. We worship her. We don't disrespect her by littering. So this was a value that I had that you can now connect to environmental stewardship. And that's something that exists within our school spaces, within academia, within the STEM world. And that's a nugget of familial capital that I had that wasn't really ever acknowledged. I wasn't ever able to talk about that when I was in school. So there's a lot that exists within our students' cultures that is powerful and of value that needs to be recognized. So another element of capital is social capital, networks of people and community resources. These peer and other social contracts can provide instrumental emotional support to navigate through institutions. So a lot of times I've heard the false narrative that communities of color don't have social capital and that the schools have to give them social capital. We have to build our students' social capital by connecting them to institutions that are maybe white dominated or having different values. So where we do want to build our overall social capital of our students, there is a whole lot of social capital that already exists within their communities that should be acknowledged and appreciated and leveraged. So that's social capital for you. And then we have navigational capital, which refers to skills of maneuvering through social institutions, especially when those institutions historically are not created for your benefit. So navigational capital is something that you will see a lot of parents of color having to navigate spaces that are not necessarily created for their well-being, having to navigate that. That's a type of capital that our students and their families have, which is why when reimagining leadership, educational leadership within your context, it's important to open channels of communication and bring community members, parents, and families into the conversation, because they oftentimes will have a better understanding of the problems within your systems than we do as professionals working within that system. So key component of transforming educational leadership is valuing that navigational capital that exists from maneuvering through unjust systems. And our last one mentioned by Dr. Yoso is resistant capital, and it refers to those knowledges and skills fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequity. And this is a form of cultural wealth. It's grounded in the legacy of resistance that communities of color have had to lead in response to oppression. So oftentimes, resisting capital is actually perceived as a bad thing. You have a student that questions unjust rules or regulations, they're seen as defiant, they're sent away, they're disciplined. We actually we see resistant capital as a asset, as something that is actually working for the interest of the student and their family in fighting systems that can be oppressive, that are historically have been created to perpetuate oppression. So that is the last element of cultural wealth that Dr. Yoso has outlined for us. And thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I was reading about, and this is kind of endemic, this is all across the country, but there's a huge, hugely disproportionate amount of students of color that experience really, terrible discipline outcomes in their school systems because their behavior is seen as inappropriate and they are disciplined as a result of it. So, districts are often looking at data about, I'm thinking about Vancouver Public Schools in my region as an example, because they had some really serious issues with disproportionate disciplining of students of color within our school, within Vancouver School District. And a lot of times those behaviors that we're seeing as defiant is coming from this resistant capital to speaking up when there is some type of injustice or oppression happening. And oftentimes we don't see that injustice that's happening, but the student will. And so they'll react a certain way to stand up for themselves, and that's seen as defiance, and there's just a huge response to it that shouldn't necessarily be there. Yeah, Jesse, I think you mentioned that you're a dean. So yeah, there's a lot of, you're fully aware of a lot of issues with just the way we discipline and how to change that, right? How to reimagine this from a different perspective that's a little bit more, not a little bit, that's just more equitable and more just. Okay, so because we don't have a lot of folks, I think honestly, I think it's just, yeah, thank you, Jesse. Hold on, trying to figure out this. Okay, what was I? There it is. Okay, so what I was planning on doing was for us to reflect on this framework, this model of community cultural wealth, and to think about how can we use this model to reframe and refine our own thinking about partnerships with schools and families. So I use the word praxis. I kind of like it. It's created by, the term is created by Paulo Freire, who I shared a quote of with you in the beginning of our time together. And it's pretty much this idea of actually acting after reflection towards transformation. So a lot of times there's academia, there's the academic world with scholars that are coming up with theories and research, and then there's the practical world, and there's a disconnect between the two. And myself as a practitioner, and then also as an aspiring scholar, I like to see the bridge between the two. I like to see some of the theory being applied to actually look at and transform our systems. So that's the idea of praxis, which I think teachers, leaders are really able to do because we're actually working in that space. So what I'd like to do now is for us to take another look at the facets of community cultural wealth. What does each of them mean? How do the professionals in your community acknowledge these elements? How are the elements being erased or dismissed in your community? It was going to be a team think. Now it's just a think by yourself.